The Haymeadow, Day 8. His father had broken a rib once, and it had been one of the small lower ones, and the doctor had told him that even taping it wouldn't help much except to keep him from moving the bone. And your body will do that as well, the doctor had said. If you try to move too much, the pain will stop you. It was the same here. He could tape her, but it wouldn't help, and she didn't seem to want to move very much anyway. He couldn't get her up into the wagon without lifting her, and even if he could, he didn't think his shoulder would let him. It would move her rib bone, and the pain would be terrible. He used dry grass and made a thick bed back beneath the wagon, and put a pan of water near the bed and another of food. Then he pulled Peg onto the bed and left her there, still on his torn T-shirt. In all of this, he had not looked at his own wound, and with Peg settled beneath the wagon, he tried to see his shoulder. Because of the angle, it was impossible to get a good look at it. There was a cut there, sideways across the muscle, and it had bled some, and there was blood down his arm. But the bleeding had stopped, and much of the pain from the cut was gone, though there was still a healthy ache from the joint inside where it had popped out and in. A mirror. He needed a mirror, and there wasn't one, not within a 2-day ride. It was full daylight now, and he went to the stream. In a calm black backwater, he leaned at an angle and studied the reflection in the water. It wasn't as good as a mirror, but he could at least see the wound directly. It didn't appear deep, and seemed to be bruised as much as actually cut, but it had to be cleaned. He had a first aid kit, and he opened it. There were bandages and small scissors and a small bottle of iodine. It had a little glass dipper to administer drops to a tiny cut. John shook his head. It would take half the bottle. He set the lid aside on the steps to the wagon, raised his arm to try to flatten the wound, closed his eyes and took a deep breath, and poured iodine from the bottle directly into the cut. Yeah! He couldn't help it. It was like pouring molten lead into a wound. The beller came out through his teeth, and he forced himself to hold the arm up until all the iodine was in the cut, and then he put one of the large bandages on it, taping it carefully. He dug in his bag in the wagon and found a shirt and put it on gently, easing his bad arm into the sleeve. The arm hurt when it hung down straight, so he used a strip from the edge of the tarp to make a loose sling to hold it when he didn't actually need it. So, he said when he was finally done. So now what? The sheep, he thought. He had to see the sheep. The bear had done damage there, torn at them, and he should have taken care of them first. No, the horse. Speck was still up there around, but he hadn't saddled her or bridled her so she could just graze. The gun. First, the rifle. If the bear came back, he needed that, and it was jammed with sand and dirt. He spread the piece of tarp and again disassembled and cleaned the 30-30 until it worked like new. He used the corner of his shirt to wipe each cartridge before reloading it in the tube magazine, and when he was finished with the rifle, he carried it in his right hand and went to Speck. She was still spooky, although it had been 5 or 6 hours since the bear, and she moved away from him when she saw the rifle. He hit it in the back of his leg until he had her halter, and she couldn't run. It's all right now. He talked to her while he petted her neck and examined her. He had worried that the bear had perhaps hit her as well, but she was fine and in moments had settled enough to nuzzle him against the stomach. He rubbed her neck and let her go back to grazing and moved to where the bear had hit. War, he said when he got there, speaking aloud without meaning to. War must be this way. The bear had been horribly, unbelievably destructive. Several sheep were still alive, but one of them was wounded so terribly that John shot it. It had been broken almost in half, struck from the top with such a force that it had almost literally been snapped into 2 pieces. Dead sheep were everywhere. The bear must have run straight into them, striking left and right, and they had been jammed together and hadn't been able to get away. One sheep was ripped pretty badly down the side, and he started to shoot her as well. He had the hammer back on the rifle and the rifle to the ewe's head, and he stopped. No more. The rip had opened the side for close to a foot, and he could see the membrane that held the intestines in. They could see the intestines dimly through the membrane, and it didn't seem possible that the sheep could live. I'll have to get you down to the wagon, he told her, and sew on it. While he was wondering how to move the sheep, it seemed sure to kill her if he moved her. The ewe walked off and started eating as calm as if nothing was wrong with her. So we'll go slow, he said. He walked in back of her and let her make her own speed, moving her left and right until he had her near the wagon. There he found some twine and tied her. Sewing the cut was both harder and easier than he thought it would be. It was hard because he had trouble starting. He found the curved needle and a package of sterilized thread and poured disinfectant on the cut. But making himself push the needle through the skin, actually push it through, was hard. The skin hung and the needle didn't go through easily, and he had to push harder and harder, and finally it broke through. For one stitch. All that for one small hole. Then he had to push it through the second side and pull the 2 ends together and tie it in a knot and pull the 2 sides of the cut together. Pull them, he thought, tightening the thread. He winced as he did, watching the skin slide back over the membrane. but the ewe stood quietly and seemed not to notice him working on her. It became easier on the second stitch, and by the time he'd finished 20 stitches, he was moving right along. The cut pulled together well, and when he was done, he put pine tar on top of it to keep the flies off. He thought of letting her go, but he worried that she would roll on it or get hit by another sheep, so he kept her tied with the twine. When he was done with the ewe, he checked on Peg again. She had been drinking water, and he thought she'd eaten some from the pan, or at least nuzzled the food around. There was still much to do. He caught and saddled Spud and went back to the war zone. As he thought of it, 16 dead sheep, he counted. The bear had gone crazy. He used his rope and Spud and dragged the sheep bodies, 2 at a time, 3/4 of a mile from the herd into a dry wash on the side of the valley floor. Buzzards would come, and the coyotes would come back. He hoped they would leave the herd alone and just clean up the dead ones, and in a few days there would be nothing but bones. But he hated it, hated the death of it, and when he pulled the last carcass into the wash and saw the mess, he thought of films he'd seen on television of mass graves in war, and it looked the same to him. The bodies lay in a pile, flopped one on another, and it was easy to see how it could be something else other than sheep, could be humans. He was relieved to turn away, back to the camp, back to sanity. Chapter 23. He wasn't sure when he saw the difference in himself or when he started to see it, but a month had gone, then another week, and he wasn't the same any longer. The camp seemed to be running it by itself. He had a ritual. Up just before light, get a fire in the stove, make coffee. He was still drinking it weak and wished he had some tea, and sit on the steps of the trailer and watch the sun come up. He had never done any of this before, sit and relax and meditate, and now he did it, and he would think while he was doing it. Not of work, or what had to be done that day, but just let his mind go and think. Once he thought of his mother and missed her, though he hadn't really known her, and another day of Tink, and again of Collie, and one morning of the girl in the car when he was at the highway. With sun up, he would saddle the horse he was going to use for the day and slide the rifle into the scabbard and move out to check the herd to see if they had weathered the night all right. The bear never came back. The coyotes did. They cleaned up the dead sheep and then tried the herd again one night, but he shot near one. He'd been trying to hit it and shot wide, and they had all disappeared, and he hadn't seen them since. But sometimes the dogs would become too enthusiastic and keep them in such a tight herd that the inner ones didn't get to good grass, and John would use his horses to break them open and spread them out. All around the herd looking for bear tracks, then back to the wagon to make breakfast. Some mystery meal from a can without a label and straight in the camp, which really only took a few minutes. He put the sleeping bag out to air, washed any dirty socks or other clothing out in the stream, gathered enough driftwood for the stove for the next day or two, and dried it beneath the wagon. Put ointment on the feet of the 2 dogs he kept tied to the wagon, rolled the tarp up on the wagon to let fresh air breeze through, unless it was raining, and then it was lunch. Another mystery meal. He was amazed at how often he would guess wrong, and after lunch check the herd again. All ordered and neat, correct, and just falling from one day to the next. He kept account of them and made the marks in the wagon, but he did not miss home, did not miss anything. It wasn't that he wanted to be alone or that he wanted to be here. He didn't want anything. A horse, he thought, and the dogs and the sheep and the mountains. That's all he wanted, or seemed to need, just like Tink had said. But there came a day when he had 47 days marked in the wagon. He was coming from the afternoon check on the herd, and he looked back down the canyon and far off and saw a figure on a horse emerge from the stream bed cut, followed by another horse, a pack horse, and they came moving slowly up along the stream. At first it was too far to tell who it was, and John sat watching, letting Speck pick her way back to the wagon. Then he saw the shoulders, the way the person was sitting on the horse, and knew it was his father, and he forgot how he hadn't missed anything, how he liked being alone, how perfect everything was, and slapped Speck on the side of the shoulders with the reins and set her into a flat-out run, heading down the canyon, waving his hat and yelling and whooping like a wild thing. Chapter 24. They sat by the fire. His father had brought a canned ham, and they had made a large supper of ham and canned baked beans, and a loaf of bread his father had wrapped in plastic and kept from drying. They'd eaten and washed their plates in the stream, each doing his own, and when the meal was finished, John made coffee, strong, the way his father liked it, and they sat by the fire on 2 short pieces of wood, and for a long time they didn't say anything, just watched the flames as evening settled in. John knew his father hadn't missed anything. He'd seen the herd on the hill and the camp and the 2 resting dogs, and once John watched him out of one corner of his eye, he seemed to nod and smile to himself. But they hadn't said much. His father rarely talked a great deal, and John found himself strangely shy. When the talk came, as the darkness came in the mountains, it was quick. That Tink, he ain't going to die. They cut some on him and did some other treatments, and they say he'll be back to work in a month or so, his father said, suddenly smiling. Tough old bird. The way I met your mother was strange. Did I ever tell you? It came so fast, slipped in on the end of a sentence, that John almost didn't hear it. He shook his head. I was over to Cheyenne on some kind of business. I can't remember what it was. And just as I walked out of a boot repair place, I tripped and went down flat on my face on the sidewalk. Knocked the snot out of me, and while I was catching my breath, I got up on my hands and knees, and I heard this voice say, "Do you know any other tricks?" And I turned over, and there she was, standing above me. The light was coming through her hair, and I'd never seen anything that pretty, not even close. I stood up, and I knew I was going to marry her. I didn't know her name, know nothing. Still don't know much, but I knew, by God, I was going to marry her if I had to move a mountain to do it, and I couldn't think of nothing nor do nothing right until I married her 9 months and 4 days after that, to the hour. He stopped just as suddenly as he had started and took a long pull of hot coffee, and John almost stared at him. He never heard his father say more than a few words at a time, and to hear him string them all together, talk about something that had happened, was a complete surprise. And it wasn't over. "You take on a lot about the old man," his father said abruptly. "That might be good, or it might not, or it might be not so good, depending. And I thought you ought to know some about him and the way he really was before you got to where you were trying to be. Well, it might just be better if you know." He took some more coffee, drained the cup, and chewed on the grounds before swallowing them and pouring a new cup. "Reason I ain't said anything before is that it wasn't time." He paused and looked around the camp, out in the coming darkness at the herd and the mountains and maybe something beyond the mountains. "Now it's time." He put the coffee down and picked up a stick and began to whittle on it with his pocket knife, not making anything. John watched the curls of wood come off with the knife, soft curls colored like honey, falling off the knife into the fire to flare up and light his face, and he sighed and spoke without looking up. "Some people started that business about the old man being a cowboy and how he came out here with nothing but his gun and 2 horses and all that. Some of that is true, but most of it, well, it's said a lot different than it really ran. He come out here with a gun, for sure, and some horses, probably a whole herd of them, and some cows. But he wasn't alone. There was a hand with him, named of Lincoln, Smiley Lincoln they called him, and they was partners, or had been partners before that. Some of the details are fuzzy, but it was said they rode out here together and took the spread as partners." "But I thought he was alone," John said. "Everybody said he came out alone." "It was what he said, not everybody else. Just what the old man said. He said it, alone. But there were other people to come along, and they saw things differently. The other people said they was partners, the old man and Smiley, and settled the spread together, and then the old man wanted it all for himself." He stopped talking for a moment. The knife kept peeling curlings off the wood, dropping them in the fire, and John watched them. Drop, flare, drop, flare. He didn't know what to think. So there come a day when the old man just said he was taking it, the spread, all for himself, and when Smiley tried to argue, the old man up and shot him. "What?" The father nodded. "That's right. He shot and killed Smiley. He said later that Smiley took a rifle out of his saddle scabbard and started to point it at him, but there were others who said Smiley was shot in the back. After he shot him, the old man dragged Smiley up into a gully and covered him with rocks. John thought of the coyotes and sheep, how he had dragged them away. But, and that's probably the truth of it all, he was mean, the old man, spit mean, and there were too many people who spoke of what had really happened to let the old man's story stand." "He was a murderer?" His father nodded. "That's about the size of it. So all this land that he took, the spread, he took it all by killing his partner?" His father nodded again, but said nothing. "Why didn't you tell me before?" "You were using it to live," his father sighed. "You didn't know the bad parts, and you were using the good parts of the story to live, and it seemed wrong to cut that down when you were using it. But now you're getting older and taking things yourself, here with the sheep and all, and it don't seem like you need that other business anymore. I was worried that you would go too far with it and turn into something like the old man." "He was a murderer?" John asked again. "He just shot his partner? Why wasn't he hung?" "Things were different then, or sort of different. Nobody saw it, so they couldn't prove it, and then there were many who were afraid to speak up. He shot several men. Seems he didn't need much of an excuse to shoot somebody. Your mama, she hated him, the memory of him." "Did she know him?" "No, except for Tink, none of us did. I saw him once in the old folks' home, but I was just a baby. They let him keep his gun there, but took the pin out of it so he couldn't shoot anybody. He died with the gun by his bed. They said he died alone. His wife, she was named Emma. She wouldn't go to be with him, though she was still alive. People think the ranch was lost to bad debts. It ain't so. That's just another story. It was Emma. She sold it all to the Easterners, sold every bit of it, and then gave the money away to a church. Why? She said it was evil, poison money from a poison place. But that ain't so. A place is just a place. It's as good to live here as it is anywhere, better than some. How it came to be isn't our business. We just live. So that's why we don't own it? Yep. All this time I thought it was just that the family didn't manage it right and lost it, and she sold it. Every square foot. She kept enough to pay for her own nursing home and to bury her and the old man and gave the rest to a church. John leaned back. The fire was dying down and he put more wood on it. Out in the night he heard the horses chewing. If they weren't sleeping, they were chewing, it seemed. Peg and Billy were tied to the wagon, and Peg whined at something in the night. They lay back and slept. She was completely recovered from the bear and worked the herd, but had stopped staying out with them when her time was done. She was spoiled and came in to sleep in the wagon. John didn't mind, although it bent Jenny's nose a bit, and they often growled at each other in the wagon at night. I'm sorry about this, his father said, about telling you all this. John shook his head. It's all right. It's better than I know. I had me a brother. John stared at him. He had never heard that his father had a brother. I have an uncle? His father took a deep breath, let it out. No, you had an uncle. He took after the old man and turned mean and went to working as a roughneck on some oil rigs down in Oklahoma, and another roughneck killed him with a piece of pipe in an oil camp bar. You never said anything about him. He wasn't worth mentioning. He was mean from the get-go, born bad. That's why I told you about the old man. My brother was the same about him. Took to talking about him all the time. Had a picture of him. I was getting worried that you might be moving the same way. John leaned back and thought about the old man, what he knew of him, and now with this new thing. He shook his head. I don't think you had to worry. Wouldn't I know if I was mean? I don't feel mean. His father smiled. Well, I guess you'd be the first to know. Are there more things about him? John asked. Any good things? Not so many. In fact, none. It was said of him that he never did a deal when he didn't come out the best, no matter what he had to do. And even when he made money, he didn't give any to Emma. He had a silver Mexican eagle spurs, and she had to make dresses out of feed sacks. He was just bad, that's all. Sometimes they come that way, people. Just come bad. For a long time he was silent, the knife still sliding through the wood, and John closed his eyes and tried to feel disappointed and thought that he would have been sad except for the sheep and the mountains and the dogs and what the past month and more had made him. I'm not, he said quietly after another long silence. Like him, I'm not like him. His father nodded. Then he took a breath and started talking again. The night he was due to be born, it come on to snowing so bad we weren't sure we would get to the hospital. So we set out early, and Tink came with us, and he had a bunch of rags, and I think that's why he didn't come for 2 more days. Your mother saw Tink sitting next to her in that pickup cab with all those rags used on sheep when they had lambs, and she told me she would wait, thank you, till we got through to Cheyenne, even if it took another month. He laughed. Man, you were ugly when you came. Lambs are prettier than people. You were all over gunk and blood, and the first thing you did was stick your fist in your mouth and try to eat. And they hadn't even cut the cord yet. They let me hold you right away, and I could fit you in one hand, my right hand. And your mama, she worried that I would drop you, but I never did. Never did. And he kept talking. John's eyes closed, and everything swirled together. The talk and how he looked as a baby, and the old man and his father whittling in the fire, the sheep and the dogs, and he could not stay awake. He dozed up on his elbow, facing the fire. Once he opened his eyes, nothing had changed. His father was still talking about his childhood and a horse he had named Scruffy or Ruffy. It didn't matter. And John dozed again and awakened once more to find his father tucking him into his sleeping bag, as he had when John was a young boy, and leaning down to kiss him on the forehead. John went to sleep smiling, thinking on how nice things could be. Chapter 25. It was the next morning. His father was set for leaving. He talked most of the night and still got up early to make a fire and coffee and feed some oats to his horse to get ready for the ride. The two were silent, but it wasn't uncomfortable. John saddled Speck to check on the herd, and his father saddled his own horse and joined him. John showed him where the bear had attacked, how he was working the herd up one side of the valley and back down to the other to keep them on fresh grass, how the herd responded to his hand motions. But at last they were back at the wagon, and it was time for his father to go, and just at that moment, John didn't want his father to leave. There was some new thing between them, from the talk all night, and he didn't want him to leave, and he finally said it. I don't want you to leave. His father had just finished tightening the pack saddle on the pack horse, and he turned and nodded. I feel the same, but there's the ranch and Collie and all. They said nothing more about it. His father mounted caught up the pack horse lead, and John mounted Speck and rode with him down the canyon, both of them riding in silence until they were near the end, and John stopped. "I'd better get back to the herd." His father nodded. "I'll see you in a month or less." And he left. Went in the small hills and was soon out of sight, gone from the valley, and John waved at where he'd been. Then he turned toward the herd and thought he would miss something now. Now, because his father wasn't staying with him, there was something special he would miss, and he didn't even know what it was. And he was halfway back to the wagon when Speck stopped. "What's the matter with you?" He nudged her into movement, but she hadn't gone 20 feet when she stopped again, and this time turned her head and looked back, just past John's leg, back down the canyon. John turned. Way back at the mouth of the valley where the stream cut through the hills, he saw the small figure of his father running back toward him, picking his way slowly. John turned Speck and set her into a lined-out run until he swung wide and pulled in next to his father, so sharp she settled on her rear. "I started thinking it wasn't but 3 weeks till we take the herd down," his father said, "and Collie can handle things down there for 3 weeks. And it's been some time since I spent any time in the Haymeadow, and there's some things I ain't told you yet." John pulled Speck over and fell in beside him. The horses walking, and thought, "Ain't it funny what makes a person glad? Just to see that little figure riding back with the pack horse in back of it, and you can feel all glad. Like the time your mother was leading the parade in Cheyenne on a palomino that wasn't good for nothing, but show and her pants split. She always did wear them too tight, her pants, and they split like a gunshot, and she went right ahead and finished the parade. I found some of that shiny tape and put that over the split and pretended she was the Queen of Sheba, and nobody said a word. Not a word. Of course she could do things like that, your mother." "Ain't it?" John thought again. "Ain't it just crazy what makes a person glad?" And they rode up the canyon into the Haymeadow, and the sheep, and the dogs, and the mountains.